but still huge amounts that we don't understand, particularly once we move away from the hummingbirds. Though even with the hummingbirds, there's a lot of unanswered questions.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Everyone knows that birds visit flowers. I mean, you can't miss the hummingbirds as they're humming and buzzing by your manzanitas at the end of the winter, or your currant flowers in the spring, or right now, in my garden, I've got hummingbirds on my fuchsias. But have you ever wondered how many other kinds of birds visit flowers, and how important are they to the overall pollination ecology of flowering plants? Well, this week, I have the perfect guest to talk about these questions, Dr. Jeff Ollerton. Dr. Ollerton is one of the world's leading experts on pollination and pollinators. He's authored over 170 articles and book chapters on the subject that are widely used in the conservation world and also in pollination science. Among all that work, he still manages to publish books, and he has a new one out with Pelagic Publishing that is focused on bird and their association with flowers. The book is titled Birds and Flowers, an intimate 50 million year relationship, and it provides a really easy to read overview of what's known in the literature about the relationship between birds and flowers. It's a really great follow-up to his 2021 book, Pollinators and Pollination, Nature and Society. And like that book, it draws extensively on recent research, and it kind of sums up the global conservation efforts around the globe for these birds. If I could tip my cards to you a bit, this conversation makes it clear. There's a lot more to the story about birds and flowers that meets the eye. So without further ado, let's take a walk on the feathery side this week on pollination. Well, welcome to Pollination, Dr. Ollerton.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here chatting with you.
Well, it is. You have a brand new book. It is Fan about birds and flowers. And I guess, maybe to start with, what are we talking about with flower visitors and birds? When I think about, I think about one group, the hummingbirds. What is the diversity of bird flower visitors?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think for most people, particularly in North America, but globally as well, when they think about birds that visit flowers, they think about hummingbirds, and that's perfectly natural. I mean, they're a spectacular family. They're a very large family, possibly the second largest family of birds there. So a lot of species,
Oh,
over 300 species. There actually over 300 and I think it's 364 species now. There's a new species just been described. So very, very diverse, very, very
hmm.
colorful. They have this very, very unusual flight mode of persistent hovering in most cases. And yeah, they make for spectacular photographs, of course. I mean, the who doesn't like to see a photograph of a hummingbird visiting a flower? But they're just one family. And one of the things that I highlight in the book is that there are at least 74 bird families, which
Oh,
include flower visitors, many of which are known pollinators and some of which are possible pollinators. They're visiting flowers in a way that means that they're going to be moving pollen around. So 74 different families from about 11 different orders of birds. And orders are the higher level taxonomy there. So hummingbirds are one family, but belong to one particular order. The passerines, there's a whole bunch of families within the passerines. That's another order. But then you have the shorebirds, they're a different order. Mouse birds, they're a different order. So an enormous diversity globally. And in fact, an enormous diversity in the Americas as well. Again, most of the attention is focused on the hummingbirds, but even in the Americas, there's a wide range of different birds that visit flowers and act as pollinator, various warblers, tanagers,
huh.
and pigeons and doves and so forth. Yeah.
Well, this is just blown my mind. This is remarkable. And I suppose, I'm part of I'm a melittologist,
Mhm.
and there's a long tradition of doubting the role of bird
Mm.
pollination. In the book, you say this position has some plausibility. Can you just maybe lay out the
Mm.
case of helping us understand why people think that birds might not be significant actors in pollination, and why, just their arrival and evolutionary time, the sheer diversity of insects. Walk
Mhm.
us through what is this case
Mm.
against birds?
Well, the subtitle to my book, Birds and Flowers, is an intimate 50 million year relationship. No, it isn't. It's a 50 million year intimate relationship. So I'm getting the title of my own book wrong. We play, yeah. I played around with different titles with the publisher then. So yeah, a 50 million year intimate relationship, and that refers to the fact that the oldest fossil that we have of that we can suppose is of a bird which visits flowers is at about 50 million years ago. It's actually 47 million years, but a little bit of
Okay.
artistic license there. And it's a bird which was found in Europe in some years ago now in Europe and in Germany, in German fossil deposits. And in its gut, it has a large mass of pollen, indicating that it was visiting flowers. Now, why it was visiting flowers, we don't know. Was it eating the flowers? Was it
Ah, yeah.
eating the pollen, which some birds do to this day? We simply don't know. But that's the earliest relationship that we have between the birds and the flowers. And I guess what is remarkable there is that um, insects have been visiting flowers for probably 150 million years, something like that. And they were visiting gymnosperms, extinct gymnosperms, prior to that. So the insects got there first. Is the first thing to say. So there's some uncertainty about why some flowers should shift to bird pollination or bat pollination. Lizards act as pollinators as well. Why does this shift away from birds from insects to birds for some species, which happens repeatedly? A group like the penstemons, for example, a very well-known North American group. There
Hmm.
have probably been about 2 dozen shifts from bee pollination to hummingbird pollination in that group. So
Huh.
we've got to ask the question: what is the advantage of bird pollination then? So that's the kind of the deep time perspective on this. Why should this evolve in the first place? But then, if we look at some of the earliest written natural history in Europe, going back to the 17th century, there were some commentators there who were in Europe who were seeing reports from North America of birds visiting flowers, and then asking this question: why are they visiting the flowers? What are they doing there? And the idea was that perhaps they were mainly visiting to eat the insects, and then later it became clear that actually they were taking nectar from the flowers. But no one really connected the idea that of the visitation with the pollination until later in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, really. And even at that time, going into the early part of the 20th century, there was still, what I refer to as nectar skepticism, the idea that birds could actually feed on nectar, that they were actually visiting the flowers for nectar. And even Darwin wrote about this. Darwin at one point was uncertain as to whether how effective they were as pollinators. And I think it partly because we've got this sort of view of what pollinators ought to be, and yes, they're bees and they're other insects, but actually the sheer diversity of pollinators that's out there is fairly mind blowing as well.
Well, it
Yeah.
yeah, it does strike me reading the book that, the devil is in the details in some ways, and the details have been
Yeah.
overlooked. You mention in the book that, and everybody knows this. Everybody, there are these pollination syndromes
Hmm.
where, a honeybee goes to a blue plant and a fly goes to a white flower and a hummingbird goes to a red flower. And you point out in the book that in some ways this may have put a blinder in our ability to even think this problem through. Can you explain a little bit about what this problem
Mm.
is?
Yeah, so there's a whole set of flower traits that have been described as being the pollination syndromes. And this is an idea again that goes back into the 19th century, beginning with an Italian botanist called Federico del Pino. And he wrote about this and wrote how there was a level of predictability within flower traits. So,
Mm-hmm.
one could look at a flower and see that it was white or possibly dull colored, often with a fairly unpleasant scent, and predict that it was fly pollinated. Or one could look at certain traits of flowers and predict that it was bee pollinated. Or in the case of birds, we could look at flowers that were red and chew and produce lots of nectar and often don't have a scent and predict that they're bird pollinated. And the thing with that is that those syndromes certainly exist. They're out there, and they in some cases the pollinators can be predicted from the flowers, but nature as always is more complicated. You study nature, I study nature. We know, that I've been studying relationships between pollinators and flowers for over 30 years now. And the more I study, the more I realize how little we actually know about this. And so the phrase I use in the book is that we can sometimes say that a flower is bird pollinated, but we can't say
Mm-hmm.
for certain that it isn't. So,
Uh,
so if I was a gambling man, which I'm not, but if I was to go to South America, which I have been several times, and I was to find a flower which was red and chew and produced a lot of nectar and didn't have a scent, then yeah, I'd predict hummingbird. But I also know that hummingbirds visit a lot of other different types of flowers. They'll visit
uh-huh.
short tubed white flowers. Well, anybody who's got a hummingbird nectar sugar water feeder in their backyard knows knows that hummingbirds will visit a wide range of different types of flowers, different colours, and so on. So we can let's say we can often predict that a flower is bird pollinated, but not necessarily that it isn't. Can't say for certain that it isn't. And some of those flowers that they visit have been shown to be effectively pollinated by the flowers. But then if we go to South Africa, where sunbirds are the dominant specialized pollinators, yes, again, you have bright red and bright orange flowers from a range of different families, including aloes. You'd be familiar with aloe vera, but there's a whole bunch of other flowers within the aloes, species within the aloes that have different types of flowers. And many of those are sunbird pollinated, and they vary in their color. But in the Cape region of South Africa, there's also a group of flowers which look as though they should be sunbird pollinated because they have tubular red flowers and produce lots of nectar and often have little or no scent. But actually, they're butterfly pollinated. So you wouldn't
Hmm.
predict butterfly pollination from that particular set of floral traits, that particular set of syndrome. But in fact, they're butterfly pollinated, and that's been well established. So it varies in different parts of the world. And the paper that we published back in 2009 suggested that if you were to go into a plant community anywhere
Mm-hmm.
in the world, and you were to pick a flower at random, probably 30% of the species that you were looking at, you could predict with some kind of certainty that what the pollinators were based on the floral traits, based on the syndrome. Now that idea has been challenged several times, and there's a lot of debate within the literature and this, and other people think that it's the predictability of syndromes is higher than that, but the highest estimate I've seen is maybe 65%. So that still leaves a lot of plants that we
Mm-hmm.
that we can't predict from the syndrome. And the other thing is, this is kind of getting away a little bit from bird pollination, but the other thing is that we're constantly discovering new types of pollinators. In fact, I have a paper in press at the moment called "What are the phylogenetic limits to pollinator diversity?" Basically,
Oh, interesting.
what other kinds of pollinators can there be out there? Because cockroach pollination has only been described in the last couple of decades. We described it for the first time in China some years ago. These specialized flowers, which are visited by several different types of cockroach at night, and the flowers smell exactly the way you might imagine a cockroach pollinated flower to smell. Fairly unpleasant, actually. But that's only been described about 11 or 12 different plant species so far. But that's because people don't look for it. I mean, most
Mhm.
cockroaches are nocturnal, as a lot of other insects are. Most pollination ecologists are diurnal. We come out during the day and do most of our research during the day. So yeah, there's a lot of other different types of pollinators out there that are influencing the evolution of flowers in ways that we just can't imagine.
Well, in the book there is a kind of call for actual data on networks and
Mm,
their actual
yeah,
structure of the different taxa and the different flower visiting
yeah,
taxa and
yeah.
the flowers. And I suppose we here in Oregon, we whenever we catch a bee, we have a iNaturalist record on the flower host. But you can't do that, I suppose. It's not so easy with birds. I guess there's a discussion there's at various points in the book the importance of
Mm,
camera traps,
mm,
of being able to document these occurrences, and maybe part of the unaccounting for bird contributions to pollination may be
yeah.
just by the fact that we just haven't seen them.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a few things to unpack in that. One is that some pollination ecologists who are studying bird-flower interactions will tend to set their camera traps up next to flowers which look as if they should be bird pollinated. And lo and behold,
Oh,
they find that the birds visit and they're bird pollinated.
oh yeah,
That's
right.
fine, but there's a circularity to that argument. If you're
Uh,
not setting your camera traps up next to flowers which you wouldn't predict to be bird pollinated, then you're going to see that those are bird pollinated. I have had that discussion with some people who study bird pollination, but I'm not quite sure that the message comes through. But this is I think this kind of circularity of thinking within there really needs to be challenged. The other thing is that we have got lots and lots and lots of hummingbird flower networks published and being analysed in different ways and asking different kinds of questions there. But we know that lots of other different types of birds are involved in those networks, but they tend to be ignored. And it again, it's the focus on the hummingbirds. Yeah, hummingbirds are fantastic, but there is I won't say an over focus on, but it certainly biases the views that or the conclusions that you can draw from studying bird flower interactions. And I say that as someone who has worked on hummingbirds. It certainly puts a bias into there, or it at least ignores the total diversity. And
well, let me get this.
yeah, go on.
Just so
Yeah,
the
sure.
issue is that a person goes out and they're studying hummingbirds,
Yeah,
and the camera trap captures something else, and they say that's not a hummingbird. I'm not interested in that, and so that whole record set sort of is buried somewhere. It's not available, or it discounts
yeah.
these other contributions.
Yeah, that
Okay.
that can certainly occur, has occurred in the past. I think it's becoming less common now. People are starting to open their minds up to the fact that some of these other birds may be important. But also, yeah, I say if you're not looking at flowers that you wouldn't predict to be bird pollinated, then you lose some of the diversity from the flower side of the equation as well. I mean, one of the issues is that certainly for some flowers, the rate of visitation by the birds is very, very low. So we studied a group of flowers in the Canary Islands some years ago, which are bird pollinated there, and there are no specialized sunbirds or Hummingbirds are honey eaters on the Canary Islands. So all of the flowers were being visited by either tits or old world warblers. And for some of some of the plants, the likelihood of a bird visiting a flower was extremely low. But the flowers would be visited maybe once every 3 or 4 days. And at the time, we didn't have any camera traps, and so we spent a long time sitting in the field waiting for things to happen. With camera traps, it becomes easier to do it, but then there's a resource cost involved in that as well, of course. What's interesting in those flowers actually is that they have very, very long lifespans. Individual flowers can last 3 weeks, which is unusual for flowers, but it relates directly to this idea that they're not being visited very
Infrequently
often.
visited.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I'd like to come back to pollination
Hmm.
syndromes. And I think everybody, I have a fuchsia,
Hmm.
hummingbirds show up. And so the color red
Yeah.
is, is one of those, it seems to be something that, as many people know, bees don't, they don't have the receptors to sense the
Hmm.
red. It raises the question of, what birds do sense when they visit flowers. And when I think about the red flowers, is it the case that they tend to be bird pollinated because the bees don't go to them, or is it because the bees are attracted to them? I kind of wondered about what are the birds actually sensing at these flowers?
Well, from the flower's point of view, it's a combination of two things. Yeah, one is that red is a very obvious signal. Many berries are red, for example, and many bird dispersed plants will produce red berries. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. As far as a bird is concerned, or most birds are concerned, then red is a really strong signal. And you've got to remember that this is all about associative learning. It's Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell and the dog knows it's feeding and or feeding time, and then you ring the bell and it starts salivating even though you don't give it
Uh-huh.
any food. So it's associative learning. So it's about the birds learning that if they visit a flower with that's a certain color, that's a certain shape, and in a certain locality, geographic position, they can find a reward there. And the red
Uh-huh.
reinforces, so it's the flowers manipulating the behavior of the birds. Bees will visit red flowers. This idea that bees don't see red or can't
Yeah.
perceive red or don't visit red flowers is something of a myth. They will visit red flowers.
Yeah. I
And
just think of all the red plume thistles
yes,
they
yeah,
seem to love.
yeah, exactly. Though the other thing to remember, of course, is that we're seeing it from our
Oh,
perspective,
for
our visual
sure.
perspective, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily from the birds or the bees' perspective. But bees and other insects will certainly don't perceive red as strongly as they do the more blue end of the spectrum. Those
Yeah.
butterflies in South Africa notwithstanding, I mean, I'd love to know what their visual acuity is if they're visiting these red flowers. And also the other thing to remember is that quite often bees and other insects are finding the flowers as much by scent, certainly from a long distance. They're finding the flowers by scent as much as by visual attraction, which again is probably a reason why many bird pollinated flowers are scentless. It used to be said that it was
Okay.
because birds have a poor sense of smell, and certainly their sense of smell isn't as well developed as their visual sense, but they can smell. And the few experiments that have been done with hummingbirds, it's been shown that the hummingbirds can visit or can locate flowers olfactorily with their noses as well as their as visually. So yeah, it's about perception and it's about the flowers evolving to be more visible, more easily observable by the birds, rather than necessarily trying to prevent the bees from visiting. Flowers sometimes actually have other mechanisms to prevent bees from robbing nectar, for example. And if you go back to the study that we did in the Canary Islands with some of the flowers there, I had a very good practical example of the way the way the flowers um, can prevent bees from visiting them. So the standard way of measuring nectar in flowers, that's done by pollination ecologists, is to take a glass capillary tube, a calibrated tube, and you draw the nectar out by capillary action. It's calibrated so you can measure it with a caliper, and then you can place a sample of the nectar onto a glass prism, which is attached to almost like a telescope. It's called a sugar refractometer. You're nodding. I'm sure you've done this yourself. And then
Oh yeah.
you look at it, and you can read the amount of sugar in the nectar. Often you get a concentration of 20%, 30%,
And as you
40%.
pointed in the book, you can then lick the prism.
Then you lick the prism. So that's my standard way of cleaning the prism. I get a little reward at the end of it. I lick the prism and I clean it with a cotton handkerchief. So I've done this thousands of times to lots and lots of different plant species. But one day we were sampling from one of the bird pollinated plants in the Canary Islands, and actually it's a digitalis, a foxglove species, which is an endemic foxglove species called Digitalis canariensis, and it's bird pollinated. And as soon as I licked the nectar, my tongue went numb. And I started to get slightly worried. But there's clearly some chemical in there, an alkaloid possibly, or some other kind of, maybe a
Mhm.
cardiac glycoside in there, which is it clearly had a negative effect on me. And I suspect that it also has a
Uh-huh.
negative effect, a repulsive effect on the bees there, because we didn't see any bees visiting those flowers, despite the fact that there's
Huh.
lots of bees in that community. The nectar is relatively easy to take out if you're a bee, but no bee visits at all. So I suspect the bees learn very, very quickly, as I did, not to take that nectar.
Well, as we're on the topic of nectar, another aspect of the book that I found intriguing, you point out at several points that it's not just the story of birds and flowers. There are these interactions with, other flower visiting insects, but also microorganisms, but also other arthropods. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of the story? Without that, you don't really understand the full relationships of flowers
Yeah,
and birds.
yeah. Yeah, so that's a chapter called Hitchhikers, Drunks, and Killers, which a few reviewers have kind of picked up on and said this is an interesting title for a chapter. I'll explain the meaning at the moment. I mean, the broad perspective on this is that when we study the relationships between any pollinator and flowers, that's only part of the ecological community there, which we're studying. Those flowers are connected to a whole group of other animals which are eating the plants, connected to fungi which are infecting the roots in a either in a parasitic way or in a positive way, what we term mycorrhizae. The animals themselves are part of a network of other interactions of predation and parasitism and so on. And once you start building those links within this sort of web of life, it starts to become incredibly complicated. And that's one of the reasons why we as ecologists try to sort of shrink our perspective a little bit and just look at a narrow focus of interactions. And so the hitchhikers, drunken killers, the hitchhikers are a group of mites known as hummingbird nose mites, which spend most of their life cycle in flowers. The
Uh-huh.
flowers are visited by hummingbirds. The mites hitchhike on the birds. They hitch a lift on the birds. They actually run up the bill of the bird and into the nostrils, and they stay there until the birds visit other flowers, and then they run off and
My goodness.
pollinize those flowers. It's quite a well-known story amongst the hummingbirds, and actually in more recently we've discovered that in some sunbirds this relationship takes place as well. And in fact, it's not as well studied as the hummingbird nose mite story, but one of the studies that I talk about in the book, let me get this story straight. It's a while since I read it. So the hummingbird, the sunbird picks up one of the mites from one of the flowers, but the mite
Uh-huh.
itself has another mite on it, which is hitching a lift on that mite. And on the smaller mite, there are fungal spores, and the fungal spores infect the flowers as they go around. So you've got this kind of layers of interaction.
Hurdles all the way down.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just extraordinary levels of complication. So that's the hitchhiker's part of that. The drunk's part of it relates to the fact that we often find yeasts in nectar. Nectar is mainly sugar and water, few amino acids, some complex secondary compounds, as I mentioned earlier, but mainly sugar and water. And of course, it's a kind of environment in which yeasts of lots of different types can thrive. So we often find yeasts there, and if the flower is open long enough and it's warm enough and there's enough yeasts there, they'll start fermenting the sugars, turn them into ethanol. And we know from a few different studies that birds can sometimes get drunk on the ethanol. It seems to affect some bees as well. And again, actually, the yeast probably move from flower to flower by hitchhiking on bees and birds as well. And then the killer's side of it is that visiting a flower for a bird or for a bee, visiting a flower, exposing itself to other predators can be quite dangerous. And there are praying mantises and there are spiders which specialize on sitting on flowers, disguising themselves either as flowers or hiding behind the flowers. And then as the bird or the bee comes in, they'll ambush them and eat them. And certainly there's published examples of praying mantises taking hummingbirds. Yes, yeah, exactly.
They must be large and strong.
Yeah, they're large mantises and they're small birds. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, and this is all part of this kind of wider web of interactions. But yeah, I most pollination ecologists try to kind of focus down on just the movement of pollen and what the pollinators are and how effective they are, because it does start to get exceptionally complex.
This question of effectiveness, I suppose, coming back to how we started the interview and, why not birds? I wonder, are there advantages to the flowers of having a bird specifically pollinating them? But in addition, do the birds in their association with the flowers start to evolve structures that are specific for this purpose? Of course, the beak of a hummingbird comes to mind for me, but I don't have a real sense of the range of these morphological adaptations. And I suppose this all kind of leads into this question: Are there specialists? Are there specialist bird pollinators that have very tight associations with a plant genus or a plant family?
There are certainly groups of hummingbirds, the sickle-billed hummingbirds, for example, that have very down-curved beaks, which are associated with certain groups of plants, particularly in Central and South America. And that seems to be a fairly tight relationship as far as the flower is concerned. For the bird, yes, they visit those flowers. Yes, they feed on those flowers. But having this down curved beak doesn't prevent them from feeding on other flowers as well. Whether they're pollinators of those flowers is a different question. But they can certainly feed on those other flowers. And of course, hummingbirds and like all flower visiting birds also feed on arthropods, on insects, on spiders, and so on. I've one of the frustrating things about reading some of the more popular books about hummingbirds is that you see statements about hummingbirds feeding almost exclusively on nectar, and it's just not true. We've known it's not true for a very, very long time. And actually, if you think through the biology of it, if nectar is mainly sugar and water, you can't make bones from sugar and water. You can't make eggshells. You can't make muscles. There's no protein within there. So they have to be getting their protein and minerals from other sources. So they'll feed, I mean, in some parts of Central and South America, at times of the year when there are very few flowers available, for hummingbirds, most of their diet will be insects and spiders.
Insects.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Sorry, we've gone a little bit off track there. Where were we with the specialism? So
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
go on. No,
Well, I guess there's two sort of there's the structural, but
mm,
I guess there's also this issue of the benefits to the flower. Are there kind of unique
right.
benefits to flowers of bird pollination, and is there
Yeah.
specialization?
Well, so that comes back to the same question that we posed earlier of, why should flowers switch from insects to birds? And there's been several different hypotheses suggested as to what the advantage of bird pollination is. But I think the most compelling reason is that the plants get much longer pollen dispersal, much further pollen dispersal,
Uh,
because
uh,
birds tend to move longer distances than most insects. So that's probably the main advantage. But there are suggestions for some other advantages, but I don't know
the
that.
outcrossing in that case, there
Yes.
would be more
Yeah.
genetic diversity to the plant
Yeah.
available.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, more opportunity for outcrossing. There is a little bit of a paradox within there because there have been some studies showing that hummingbird pollinated groups within the Andes speciate, they evolve at a faster rate than non-hummingbird pollinated groups. Now,
Oh,
one of the prerequisites for that evolutionary drive is genetic isolation of small populations. But then if you've got hummingbirds that are flying several miles and linking together these small populations genetically, then we wouldn't expect to get high levels of speciation there. So there's a real paradox within there,
huh,
and
that
I
is interesting.
yeah, but it's been
Huh.
studied in so few cases that it's hard to really draw conclusions there. Yeah,
Enough gene flow to explain the more rapid evolution, but not enough gene flow that it loses its distinctive
yeah,
character.
yeah,
Is it okay?
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Lots of unanswered questions here, as there is in a lot of biology, of course, a lot of ecology. Yeah,
What about the last part of my very complex, layered question?
yeah.
Specialization. Do we have bird specialists on certain flowers?
You mean specialized birds or specialized flowers?
Oh, no. I mean, are there birds that really have high fidelity to visiting a flower of a genus or a family?
Um, well, it depends what we mean by specialization here, which is a complex question in itself. There are no birds that subsist just on a single flower. That they I might contradict myself in a moment, but generally speaking, no, there are no
This
birds
is
that.
being recorded.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great. Just a conversation between you and I. That's great. Uh, There are no birds that subsist just on a single flower, for obvious reasons. If the flower goes extinct, the bird will go extinct. So that kind of mutual dependency is extremely rare and uncommon across plant pollinator interactions, not just within birds and flowers. So the only really good examples of kind of mutual specialization, one flower, one pollinator, are in pollination systems that have been derived from seed predation systems. So things like yuccas and yucca moths, or figs and fig
Uh-huh.
wasps. There's a few other examples like that. That seems to be a special case. The other example, I guess, is where flowers are fooling, they're mimicking things like rotting flesh, and occasionally they'll get a single pollinator which visits. But the pollinator usually isn't reliant on the flower. It's actually being
Uh-huh.
fooled into visiting the flower because it thinks there's somewhere to lay its eggs. So those are really the only examples of kind of mutual dependency within there. It's a really risky thing to do for a pollinator or for a flower to be completely specialized on another specialist, if you like.
Hmm.
So most flowers that are specialized, special, say a If we go to Costa Rica, for example, and we look at a flower that only has a single hummingbird pollinator, that hummingbird will be the pollinator of a lot of other flowers within the community. And so specialists tend to interact with generalists is another way of thinking about that.
Well, this has been in the course of reading the book and the interview, it's clear we've got, birds have very, are not have a very unique evolutionary and natural history associated with flowers, maybe distinctive from other flower visitors. And I guess one might want to not draw the same, or maybe it is the same parallels in terms of conservation and ways to rehabilitate habitat or plant communities for bird pollinators. So what is the current status for bird pollinators? Are they experiencing the same kind of difficulties that other taxa are? And what's an approach moving forward for restoration? You talk in the book about paella, a very popular Spanish dish that has evolved over time, has the ingredients that people used 10 years ago, 100 years ago may not be what we use at the present. And, what would restoration for bird pollinators mean today as opposed to, what they may have evolved with?
Yeah. The paella analogy came from me doing field work actually with my wife on Tenerife in the Canary Islands. And we had a pretty tiring day collecting data there, and my wife got very, very fed up by the end of it. She's not an ecologist, she was just out there helping me. And I promised her a good meal and a glass of wine. And so we ended up in a restaurant, and I took a photograph of her about to tuck into a big plate of paella and tweeted it. And a Spanish colleague said, "That's not paella. It's, what did he call it? Arroz con cosas." I think it was rice with everything. So it's this idea that it wasn't authentic. And so I looked at the history of paella and what it was supposed to be authentically. And actually, it's varied a lot over time. I mean, the some of the earliest recipes in the 18th century had rodent meat in various types of water voles were being used, and there were certain regions within Spain that had their own kind of speciality with that. And it's clearly changed over time. It's clearly evolved over time. What does this have to do with conservation? Well, our targets for conservation shift as well. The sorts of habitats that I might have been familiar with, or you might have been familiar with when we were younger, or when our parents were younger, or our grandparents were younger, often they don't exist anymore. They've changed. So we can look at what we think of as being a natural landscape, but actually it's not natural. It's changed often through human influence. We refer to this as sort of shifting baselines. Our own baseline of what a natural habitat should look like is very different. I mean, if you go back to North America prior to European colonization, the landscapes there were very, very different. If you go back to North America in the 19th century compared to now, the landscapes were very different. But we still have this sort of idea of what a natural landscape should look like. And similarly, we have this idea of what paella should look like. I mean, I've tried or taste like. I've tried lots of different paella, and most of them are pretty good. So it was a metaphor that I used within the book. Why is conservation like paella? So that then leads us to this idea of restoring nature. What should we be restoring nature? Sometimes we might have a good idea of what we want to restore to, but often we don't, and it might actually be impossible to restore it to what it once was. And actually, the best example of that, I think, which I talk about in the book, is on Hawaii, where you had two groups of specialized flower visiting birds, the Hawaiian honey eaters, which are not related to the honey eaters we find in Australia, the Hawaiian honey creepers. And the Hawaiian honey eaters have the sad distinction of being the only family of birds that's gone completely extinct. So it's only a small family, 5 or 6 species, but all of them have gone completely. So we've lost those. The Hawaiian honey creepers, there are still a number of species which are more or less common, but most of them are extremely uncommon. Some have not been seen for decades, are probably
Oh, really?
extinct, and there's a group within that we know have gone completely extinct. There's some of that extinction happened prior to European colonization. The indigenous Hawaiians were hunting them for feathered headdresses and capes and so on, and we know that they went extinct then. And then when the Europeans arrived, they drove further extinctions. They also introduced rats, which predate upon the young and the eggs. We introduced avian malaria there, which is transmitted by mosquitoes, and that's having a big impact as well. So the birds there in Hawaii have been really, really devastated. But there was also a whole group of plants, in fact, several distinct groups of plants, which were pollinated by those birds. And again, some have probably the plants have gone extinct, but quite a number are still there. They're still living. They haven't gone extinct, but in a sense, they're sort of functionally extinct because they're not being pollinated. They're producing very, very little seed, maybe a little bit of seed by self-pollination, but
Oh,
but the
uh-huh.
but the populations itself are not expanding. They're critically endangered. So then there's a question: so what do we try to restore this habitat to if the pollinators are not available for those flowers? Interestingly, there's a species of white-eye in the genus Zosterops that's been introduced, probably as a songbird originally to Hawaii by people. And for some of those flowers, it's taking on the role of a pollinator there. Now, is that a situation that we want from a conservation point of view, to have a non-native
Uh,
pollinator visiting these native flowers? Maybe it's something that we just have to accept.
it's the new paella.
It's a new paella, exactly. It's a new paella. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of the last two chapters within the book. The penultimate chapter is all about the bad news stories. It's all about conservation issues, how many different types of hummingbirds are critically endangered and so on. I mean, the truth is most of them are doing pretty well. Over 70% of the hummingbirds are actually doing quite well as far as we can tell. Same with the sunbirds, but some are close to extinction, and we've lost at least three species of hummingbirds. But the last chapter in the book, because I didn't want to end the book on a very negative note, the last chapter within the book is called The Restoration of Hope, and it's all about restoration projects in different parts of the world, not just in the Americas. In Hawaii, there's something called the Maui Bird Forest Project, which is restoring some of those forests specifically for the honey creepers and the other endemic birds. But there's similar things happening in South Africa, for example, with the sunbirds. Things happening in Asia as well. So there is a lot of positive activity going on, and we really need to be talking about that much, much more, because it's very easy to get into a mindset of what a friend of mine, Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist, what he describes as being doomism. This idea that we are doomed. Why are we bothering? Everything is going to hell in a handbasket. Let's not bother. And that's a really, really dangerous and negative position to be in. And I think, you know, it it's dangerous not just for us, but for our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren. What are we going to leave behind for them? So we've got to be, realistic, but at the same time really celebrate some of the positive stories of things that are happening. And a place like Australia, I visited Australia a couple of times, and some great bird conservation projects happening out there. Some of them focused on honey eaters, which are proving to be really, really successful. And yeah, we need more of it. There's not enough going on, but we need more of it.
Well, I think the book is a great entry point to, of course, getting inspiration for projects that are going for bird conservation. But I also really love about the book is just the genuine curiosity And there is a real frontier of knowledge that we're just starting to scratch at, that I hope also is a source of inspiration for people to get out and, this curious world that's around us that has been, there's been these interactions going on for millions of years, and we are just starting to learn about some of them.
Yeah, and absolutely. And that's what's driven me throughout my career. I've not had a very strategic career. I've just tended to sort of follow my nose and look at the things that interested me. But I'm really glad you enjoyed the book. It was a real pleasure to write. I mean, it's a vast scientific literature for this topic, but still huge amounts that we don't understand, particularly once we move away from the hummingbirds. Though even with the hummingbirds, there's a lot of unanswered questions there. So yeah, I enjoyed writing it, and it's heartening to hear that people enjoy reading it as well.
Well, I encourage our listeners to pick up a copy. We'll have a link to where to purchase it in the show notes, and I really can't emphasize enough, it is this wonderful balance. I think our listeners will have had a sense of this, a wonderful balance between really the cutting edge of the science, but presented in a way that isn't, dense. It's a really readable, enjoyable text. Congratulations on this achievement.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very kind of you to say
so. Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button, where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.